Afternoon, everyone. We'll get started in just 1 minute. We'll let people join.
Hi, folks. Thanks for coming.
1 minute. Well, we'll get started, and if more folks join, the more the merrier. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dee Logan. I'm a project manager at the Transitions to Adulthood Center for Research at UMass Chan Medical School. And I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Hype on Campus, Initial Results from an Educational Support Intervention for Young Adult College Students with Mental Health Conditions. And with me today, we have Dr. Michelle Mullen. She is the PI of the study you'll be hearing about, as well as the director of HYPE, the intervention itself. And along with her is Debbie Nicolelis, her training director, as well as the training director here at the Transitions to Adulthood Center for Research. Michelle is a member of our faculty, as well as a member of the faculty of the Department of Psychiatry. Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping things. All attendees are muted with their cameras off, but you can please feel free to use the chat or the questions box to send questions to Dr. Mullen and Debbie for them to answer. And Dr. Mullen will be pausing throughout to allow for questions during, as well as there'll be questions after she finishes the presentation. It would be awesome if you could put your name and where you're from and your role in the chat, just so we get an idea of who's here with us in the room. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mullen and Debbie. Thank you.
Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us today. It is 1:30 here on the East Coast. So for those of you on the West Coast, good morning. So today our conversation is really about a modification to a recent trial that was impacted by COVID. So we're going to talk a little bit about Hype on Campus and our preliminary results. So I just want to say out loud that these are our ideas and that the government and neither cannot be held accountable for the things I say today, but we want to give many thanks for their support in our research. So we're going to start with some additional thank yous for our internal staff here, and we'll talk a little bit about the Hype on Campus rationale, and then we'll move into the Hype on Campus study and an overview of preliminary results. So I do want to say that this project is really the group effort of folks internally here to UMass, as well as our external folks who partnered on this. But I wanted to give a big thanks to Debbie, who you see here on our screen today, who really oversaw training our folks up on the intervention and ensuring that people were well supported, our MSW students, in providing the intervention through the duration of the study. Catherine Sabella oversaw the research methods and procedures to ensure that those two parts of the house were separated, but yet well coordinated, and Zhang Yu Beck, who ran our data analysis. And those are very important humans. And then we have the people who really made the thing go every day. So a special shout out to the folks here at UMass, particularly Sam Hirsch, who was here through the entire, probably the longest standing member of our team for staff-wise, as well as Louise Harkins, May Pearlstein. And some of our other folks that are listed here have moved on to other places, but were critically instrumental to the work. So many, many thanks. So for those of you who work on campus or with college students with mental health conditions, As you know, those groups of young adults are considered one of the most rapidly growing diagnoses on campus. And so historically, what we've seen is about 20% of students report a previously diagnosed mental health condition, and that's through the ACHA survey, and that's been pretty consistent. Recently, what we've seen from our colleagues in the field is that students are now upwards of 60% reporting symptoms that would meet clinical criteria for depression and anxiety. Um, and about a decade ago, only 30% of the student population experienced that level of symptoms. We also know that utilization rates is steadily climbing on campuses. And so while we know like that in and of itself, right, is not problematic for college campuses, we like celebrate that there is greater diversity on campus and students with mental health conditions are on campus with their lived experiences. So that's amazing. The presenting problem, however, is that we see a very high rate of dropout among this group. And so this group is seen as perceived as the highest rates of college dropout. There's an estimation of about 86% of students who are enrolled prematurely drop out of school. So this has tripled the rate of freshmen. In a recent study that I've done with my colleagues at Rutgers and Temple, nearly 70% of the students we had in one study had at least one failed attempt at school because of their mental health condition. 25% of those had two failed attempts, so they enrolled or they were in classes for a semester, but they left prematurely, and 44% were on third or more. So this is a real issue. Students are able to get into these settings and are expected to be able to meet the demands of the coursework, but something happens en route. And it has been a commonly held belief that students with mental health conditions have these high rates of cycling in and out of school because of poor grades and their mental health symptoms. However, a part of our work here at UMass is really to challenge this narrative because this seems to be a narrative of convenience. And the reason why this is so important is whatever the narrative is dictates the type of work you do and what is funded. And so when we look to the literature, we actually don't see much support that the GPAs and grades are the reason that people leave. So if you look to the literature, you see GPAs, while maybe students in their schools are doing better, that they're still good, right? So this very widely cited project or study, I should say, had a GPA of a 3.2. Well, their colleagues or their compatriots at the school that did not have mental health symptoms had a 3.3. So while it is lower, 3.2 is lower than a 3.3. It is not really lower than a 3.3, right? So when we look to our own samples that we have in our studies, we found that students from a larger community sample, so up to 18 schools, had a GPA of a 3.0 at baseline. Another study had a 2.9. And so while these show that there may be some areas of improvement, it does not suggest that this is the reason why people drop out of school. So we believe that this is a very, very simplistic version of maybe a more complex story. And so this narrative of, oh, it must be your symptoms that you drop out is what I would argue, rooted and based in discrimination, like really thinking about like the mental illness model. And so when we think the problem is symptoms and grades, or at least symptoms, that's how we focus our services are on those classic mental health symptoms. And that unfortunately impacts many of the things that are offered at school, as well as the narratives that students and young people start to adopt about the reasons why they struggle in school. So for HYPE and for our work here at UMass, we've had a series of studies that have informed our current project that I wanted to share with you as we move into discussing the HYPE on Campus project. So in our previous studies that we have collaborated with Rutgers and Temple, we have seen that students report in these trials that they do not effectively um, connect to campus resources. So that's specifically accessibility services or disability services, counseling or CAPS, and career services. So the things and that academic services provide, those students are not successfully attaching to that. When we ask students like what gets in the way of staying in school or doing well in school, in this first trial that we had conducted in 2008, students were endorsing executive functioning skills more often than these classic mental health symptoms or managing mental health symptoms when we were talking about academic barriers. The other component that really switched how we started thinking about our work here at UMass was the results of a trial referred to as FAST, which we'll talk about. When we taught executive functioning skills, students experienced greater levels of academic persistence, greater levels of self-efficacy, they used more cognitive strategies, and they reported fewer academic barriers. And so this started to shift the way that we thought about supported education and educational interventions for students with mental health conditions. There were lots of people who were focusing on psychoeducation and managing symptoms, but then we took a bit of a unique look at this for how do we actually teach executive functioning skills to students. And so with the help of a colleague, Beth Twomley, we modified her intervention. That is a compensatory cognitive remediation intervention. And so Dan Eisenberg said, that's a bit of a mouthful. Like you're going to have to think about another way of referring to that. So now we call it a coaching intervention. So, but usually we started calling this FAST with an A for academic skills training. We moved it to skill and strategy training so it could be applied across education and work. So this is a 12-week or 12 session, but 1 hour session a week. Where we teach students executive functioning skills, and it's based on the goal. So what do you struggle with, and how can we, build these interventions, supports, and services around those? So it is a deliberate practice and distributed learning. So you start with small steps and you build over that. And so the most, I think, impactful learning from this earlier trial, which we'll talk a little bit more about today, was that when you taught students executive functioning skills without any additional mental health support, this was only this 12-week, 1 hour a week curriculum, that when we taught that, we saw that the odds of academic persistence increased by 6 times. So students were more likely to complete one additional academic year of work. And when you think back to that attrition rate, that's pretty astounding. So this got us very, very excited about the importance of executive functioning skills. So we're going to pivot a little bit now to the project at hand, and this is Hype on Campus. So we had proposed a study, HYPE, which stands for Helping Youth on the Path to Employment, to support college students and to test its efficacy. Then COVID happened, and we had this great plan of training people in person, on campus, and lots of things were disrupted during COVID. So we kind of had to make lemonade from the lemons. So lots of bad things happened during COVID, but this was one of the good things. So we modified our HYPE trial to be HYPE on Campus, where we embedded HYPE at a university. And the purpose of HYPE then was to act as a bridge between disability accessibility services, counseling, psych, career services, academic centers, so that students could effectively connect with those services and utilize those services, because attachment in previous trials showed that they had very, very low rates of usage. So what the intention of this trial was, it was to be able to identify students who would be at differential risk of dropout and to fill in the gap. What are the things that they need to be able to successfully utilize resources on campus, but that did not duplicate any resource on campus? So we wouldn't provide tutoring services, for instance, because there are services on campus, but rather how do you get them connected? What are the skills that they require to reach out and to maintain connection? And so while we assisted with coordination, we really focused on what are the elements that would disrupt students in being able to maintain their matriculation and enrollment at school. So in addition to that, the goal of Hype on Campus was also to develop that critical social and human capital. Like, how do you get connected to your professors? What kind of internships? What kind of working experiences? So how do you create that resume or CV so when you come out of college that you are well prepared to move into your desired career, or at least the entry into your desired career. As many of you may know, if you serve students who have mental health conditions, is that we have a very uninformed cycle of what type of accommodations and assistive technology could be helpful, and that there's like these standard accommodations and AT that are offered to students with mental health conditions that may not actually meet their needs. So often I say extended time is nice, but it's not always helpful. So if you have difficulty with processing speed and you need more time to learn something, then that's a very, very helpful accommodation. But if that's not what you struggle with, sometimes more time just means that you procrastinate just as long and you start the assignment right before the deadline, right? So that's not a helpful accommodation because it actually doesn't help what the problem is. So really what Hype on Campus intends to do then is to inform the cycle. So help to identify what are the things that the person functionally struggles with, and how do you talk about that with disability services and your mental health provider that needs to then recommend those accommodations, because often mental health providers are not trained in assistive technology or accommodations. So the goal of Hype on Campus was really to fill in the gaps. So for those of you that know much about supported education, it's taking a supported education model and putting it into an environment that has a lot of other services and being able to leverage those services well. So Hype on Campus, we realized that you have to teach a lot of skills to students as a way of like helping them to be more successful in their coursework, but really for academic persistence. And so we made the determination that FAST would be included as a part of Hype on Campus. And so oh, so sorry. I think I just did something. Can we see? What can we see? Debbie D, did I?
I see
We
your
can see,
desktop.
yeah.
Oh, that's a terrible thing to see. Okay, perfect. I don't know what just happened there.
Now
Great.
it's back.
Yes, I saw Slack popped up and then you saw the ugliness of my of my desktop. But so as a part of Fast on Hype on Campus, we wanted to embed the curriculum of FAST, because what FAST provides then is a very structured set of teachings to help develop a very complex set of skills. So executive functioning skills is really that kind of the ability to orchestrate what do you need to do with what are you doing now. And so what you're seeing here is the table of contents to the right, as well as what we would consider the four major modules of FAST. So for FAST, we teach perspective memory, which is remembering to remember. And this really focuses on things like time and task management. We'll talk a little bit about this in the upcoming slides. We focus on attention. It is hard to remember things if you are not attending to the thing, as well as memory. It is hard to do well in class if you cannot then recall that information. And then the last part that we focus on is cognitive flexibility. So how do you assess if things are working well or not? And then how do you change your strategy? And so those are the four modules that are taught in FAST. And so by combining this specialized support and services, what do you need to be successful? How do we get you there? With FAST, that becomes the Hype on Campus offering. So before I move on to methods, I just wanted to check in with Debbie to see if there are any questions in the chat or clarifying components.
No, just a question about getting the recording, and we will be sending out the recording. Thank you, Dee, for putting that in the chat. So not yet, Michelle.
Great. Maybe we can edit out that create that like flash moment of Slack too. If not, then this is real life. Okay. So as I had said earlier, we had to do a lot of COVID related design modifications. And I think one of the two of the greatest things was, during COVID, we couldn't actually go places and do on campus training. At one point, there weren't even students on campus, if you remember. And that was one of our major motivations of focusing HYPE on campus, is that college students were differentially affected. Not a lot of people were displaced from their typical places of living because of COVID, but college students were. They were essentially evacuated from campus and then sent to places, home or otherwise, where they then differentially or really needed to rely on their executive functioning skills like planning. Now they're all on computer, they're not going to classes. And so we thought that this would be a particularly helpful intervention during this time. So we had to move from how do we do this, like us training people on campus. So we used an internship model. We also knew that students were not having opportunities within finding internships and doing internships. So we identified that if we could partner with schools to use a student internship model, so MSW interns and occupational therapist interns, that then we could train them to provide the intervention. We thought that this would be also a good rationale, that if this was successful, then this is a low cost option for schools to be able to develop tailored and sustainable services without a lot of funds, and by developing the competencies of practitioners in complex interventions. Additionally, we had to figure out how do we train all these humans in a setting where we can't go to them necessarily. So how do we do that well? So we flipped from in-person to web-based training. So we relied pretty heavily on Zoom and on Moodle, where we provide live synchronous training and TA via Zoom, and we provided asynchronous training via Moodle. So people saw something asynchronously, came together, talked about it, practiced it, got some feedback, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. So our HYPE on Campus project, we had 3 phases really, which was how do we do the thing? And that was preparing for our feasibility trial. So we recruited MSW students. At one point, we had both MSW and OT students, but that's a separate webinar. And the OT students had a greater difficulty because of how their OT internships were structured. And eventually we consolidated to just MSW students. So we recruited MSW students, and we went through this process with the school of being able to secure how to do work on campus. And then in 2021, we started the open feasibility trial. So that was 1 semester of services. And really the questions what we were asking is, can we do this here? What do we need to know? How is it training MSW students? And so then in fall 2021, we started the pilot randomized trial, where students, we recruited on campus, and then students were randomly assigned to 2 conditions. And students were available, depending on when they came into the study, to participate in HYPE and receive HYPE or the control conditions services for up to a year. We collected data through 2023 to be able to assess the durability of the intervention. And really what we were trying to figure out is, can this work happen on campus? Can we effectively train MSW interns? Can we effectively support supervisors? And essentially, how does this work on campus? Because we had never done a model like this before, especially virtually. So I want to quickly go through the questions that we were asking of the trial. So we wanted to know, does hype actually enhance students' ability to persist? Like, do they stay in school for longer? We recognize that the number of disruptions is like pretty high for college students in most times. We also wanted to look at progress. Do students stay in classes? Do they take fewer incompletes or drop fewer classes if they were a part of hype? And we wanted to look at the self-regulated learning. So self-regulated learning, I would say, is really very, very closely connected to executive functioning skills. So if you teach executive functioning skills, you have greater self-regulated learning. So am I doing the thing that I need to do to get this paper in on time? The third set of, or second set of hypotheses and exploratory analyses, we really wanted to see if you were a part of this trial, did you report fewer barriers if you were in the HYPE services? And did you experience greater self-efficacy? We wanted to explore some of the student level factors, which we won't talk a lot about today, as well as self-efficacy and some of these quality assurance. So as I had said earlier, we wanted to ultimately do a pilot RCT. And so we partnered with a large, primarily residential 4-year university, which was a selective university. So students, there's an acceptance rate about 42%. And they had pretty high SAT scores at the time. Now, most universities, as you know, do not require SATs. But these students were what you would consider like pretty high achieving students. So we trained 2 waves of MSW students, so 8 students in total. And we had 1 wave in the academic year of 2020, and then in the summer of 2021. So there was 2 teams of 4 providers that we kind of mixed up after training. So half were assigned to a psych clinic and half were assigned to disability services. But because of the 2 groups were trained differently, we thought it was important to kind of mix them up, to mash them up. So as a part of the study, we also wanted to better understand the diagnostic kind of criteria of the students who were coming in. Our main goal was to identify students who were struggling and who are at risk for dropout, which we'll talk about in a second. So we use the E-Mini to better understand the experiences of students. And then students reported at baseline, so when they came into the study, December of 2021, Feb of 2022, June of 2022, and December of 2022. In between those, what would be considered like milestone periods, students also completed a brief survey every month in between. So we had 11 check-in periods. So students, we were recruiting from 18 to 30. They needed to have what would be like classically considered an Axis 1 diagnosis, and they needed to be taking more than 6 credits. They needed to have at least 1 prior academic disruption due to their mental health condition, or 3 or more academic barriers that were related to disruption. Those that were excluded were those that had ASD, a traumatic brain injury, or other neurologic condition that affects cognition. And this was really just so that we could test for those with what was previously called Axis 1 diagnoses. We know that there's a very high rate of shared diagnoses with learning differences, ADD, ADHD. So thinking if you had that was your primary condition, ADD, then you were excluded. But if it was a part of your experience, you were not. So other exclusion factors, we made, I would say a mistake, but we realized in previous trials that we could not have first semester freshmen because we didn't have something to compare things to, and they needed to be able to, they couldn't graduate before December of 2020. I'll talk a little bit about our conditions and a little bit more about our training. So as I had said, we took 2 groups of MSW interns, and we trained them. It was approximately 200 hours of training. Now, these students This was during the 2020, like there was no internships to be had in person. Students were watching videos of what does it look like to provide services. So we had provided a pretty intensive training with a stipend so that students could develop the skills required to provide a complex intervention. So we wanted to provide both in-depth training and practice experience before service delivery. So we provided a lot of this asynchronous training. So we did a lot of voice threads, so recorded PowerPoints and talking heads, as well as live technical assistance. We use an implementation strategy called audit and feedback, but like for any of us old school folks on the phone, it really just means like we listened to their recording and we gave them feedback. And we use that to both ensure for quality as well as to rate fidelity to the intervention. Students, as a part of their technical assistance throughout the duration of the project, would develop and present student conceptualizations so that we could help to inform how do you think about students and how do you identify barriers and red flags and how do you utilize strengths to be able to help someone complete the semester and move on to the next semester or to graduation. So individual TA was recommended after kind of this robust training, but it was mandated if someone did not meet adequate fidelity scores, which we'll talk about in a little bit. In addition to that, we had weekly team meetings with each of the two groups. So if you have any questions about the training, please drop that in the question and answer, and we can talk a little bit about that at the end of our discussion today. So HYPE on campus, as I had said earlier, was up to 1 academic year of HYPE services. So if you came in early in recruitment, then you were eligible to participate for that full academic year, the fall and the spring semester. Our project was really highly dictated by the terms of the MSW students. So our students were graduating in May, and so that's when services needed to end. And I think that there were some pretty significant learnings about how long does it take to embed yourself on campus and recruit students. And so we had to extend our recruitment period further than we thought we would need to. So in addition to being partnered, it was at HYPE on campus is an individualized service. So each student that came in that was assigned to HYPE on campus, you had a provider. So it was one-on-one services with weekly meetings. They're really based on the student's goal. How did they want to improve? What are the things that they needed to really to reduce disruption or prevent disruption? And so as a part of those weekly meetings, HYPE services included FAST for the first semester. We focus on the development of education and employment goals, providing individual support and skill development to be able to meet whatever the goal is that they wanted to meet, which was an academic goal, and then help to connect them to campus services so that they were able to identify the services that they need and get connected. One of our beliefs is that if you teach a young person how to do that early in life, then they can replicate that process in other environments. So most of what HYPE on campus does is not do for a student, it's do with the student so that they can do for themselves. Really about that idea of how do we develop skills and resources alongside so then they have the skills in the future to be able to do that and experience. So FAST, just to come back to this, FAST was embedded in HYPE on campus. In our previous trials, one of the benefits of having a research agenda where you've tested something separately and together is that we saw in previous trials that providers sometimes have a hard time teaching skills, especially skills that they don't themselves have. And prior to YouTube and Dr. Google, it was very hard to find things to demonstrate skill development. So, but we also know that if you tell someone to do something, that doesn't actually mean that they develop the skill to do it. So if I say, okay, use your calendar, that doesn't tell me how I should use my calendar and when do I use my calendar and what do I put in my calendar. And So the fast was embedded because it's highly manualized and directive. I'm like, okay, you do this, now you do that. So it is really myopically focused on executive functioning skills and strategies. And so the structure of this 1 hour meeting that would happen in Hype on Campus is that you reviewed your agenda, like what are we doing today? What did we do last time? You introduced the topic. Why are we talking about this? What's the benefit of this? How do you currently do this thing? And then we practice it. And typically we practice with some type of game. And so that then that kind of it generalizes the skill so that you're applying it in a fun way. And then we move from this fun way of like testing out the skill and how do you use the skill and the purpose of the skill. And typically in a game, you see the benefit of the skill right away. And then we move to application. So how do you apply this thing, either strategy or skill, to that of a student? And then there's a home exercise. So the idea is that this distributed learning is that we teach something, we practice something, we apply something, and then we ask them to do something from this time to that time, which is a week. So I wanted to highlight some of the things that we teach in FAST. The idea for FAST is that while you are teaching little things that cascade and become a larger and more important thing, what you're really doing is creating powerful habits. So, one of the main things that we teach is calendaring. And for anyone here on this call, if I were to take your calendar, the real question is, would you know what you're doing on Monday? And I would have no idea what I'm doing on Monday. So I, and most people who use calendars have a habit. You don't even think, let me go check my calendar. That's just what you do. And you follow your calendar, but lots of people don't do this. And so they keep it all up here and it becomes very overwhelming. And if you're a college student, if you keep everything up here, you have 5 different bosses with lots of things to do all the time. And so calendaring is one of our most important things that we teach, but the habit of doing it is probably the most critical component, which is you no longer think, I need to write this down on my calendar. You just write it down on your calendar or you just put it on your to-do list. So the power of FAST is really creating these habits that take the thinking out of doing because we practice it all the time. So goal setting is a really important thing. As I said, this perspective memory, time and task management, I would argue the most important skill to self-regulation and success for young people is this idea of like, where do I put all the information I have and how do I do the thing? And that's calendaring, to-do lists, and then really figuring out when do I do what so I can meet those deadlines or meet those expectations. So sequencing and prioritizing tasks. We use other strategies like self-talk. If you're doing something really complicated, saying it out loud so you hear yourself doing that. The use of timers and reminders so that you're not holding that all up here at the same time. We tend to forget, and that turns a very heavy cognitive load, as well as these things of automatic places. So if you lose something all the time, you just always put it in the same place. As well as this kind of differentiation between, do I do 1,000 things at one time or do I do one thing until I don't do it anymore and then I switch? So there is a series of strategies and tasks and skills that we teach that then over time become a pretty sophisticated set that students become nimble at using these skills and strategies when they need them. And some of them are just habits that they no longer think about, which is amazing. So students got assigned to Hype on Campus, which included FAST, or they were assigned to campus services as usual. So Hype was provided by our MSW students. The campus services as usual was provided by our research staff. And that was a 1 hour meeting with a control group specialist that was offered at the beginning of each semester. And the idea was like, hey, like you gave us all this great information about you, which was in our baseline assessment. What are some of the things on campus that would be super helpful to you? So you identified this as a barrier. And so we're going to connect you to these resources. So the idea was that we weren't giving a lot of support, but we were giving information, and we developed a resource packet so that students could identify what are the things on campus that would be helpful for them to get connected to. Because once again, we saw very low rates of utilization earlier in our research. So students were not limited to anything. They could use anything on campus, and we wanted them to. And so those folks were our comparison group. So we have some pretty consort tables here for you. So we had, at the time that we closed recruitment, at the time that we closed recruitment, we had 472 inquiries. We had advertised for this trial as like, hey, are you struggling with time and task management? Do you have difficulty finishing your work on time? Like really focusing on the disruption of school. And do you have a mental health condition? So of those 472 inquiries, we had 154 that met the requirement that we had identified earlier for you. And 140 people were consented. I do want to say that one of our greatest kind of learnings was if we're going to do something like this on campus again, we would start recruitment or at least advertising that this thing was on campus much earlier. Because after we closed recruitment, we had an additional 136 inquiries, like within a couple of months. So that was a real learning for us that when you're brand new for campus, it is hard for people to get, it's hard to get the word out. So of the 104 that were consented, 37 were excluded and 103 were randomized. So we actually had like pretty equal distribution from HYPE and the control condition. So 52 were in HYPE, 51 in control, and about 20, well, not about 26 were randomly assigned to either disability services or the psych clinic. So, Debbie, I'm just going to pause for 1 second. Were there any questions or clarifications in the chat before we move on to some of our student participant characteristics?
No, not in the chat, but feel free to. Oh, sorry, there is one actually. Were there any specific screeners that you used to decide eligibility?
Yes, we actually created them. That's a very good question. And so when students found the flyer, so we had our MSW students at Canvas, the campus, as well as the surrounding community with a QR, like a flyer, paper flyer and QR code. We also did that electronically and through the mechanisms. And then they went to an eligibility screener that essentially said like, hey, do you go to this school? Do you have any of these things? And they would like click through, quickly, click, click, click. And of the students that met the criteria and ones that didn't really require conversation, then that got pushed to our research staff. And then our research staff would reach out and then clarify the content and any additional conversations. At that point, students were then eligible or not eligible. And the E-mini was used just to confirm, that's the diagnostic interview, just to confirm that they had a diagnosis that met our criteria. And what we found is that students very accurately self-report on their mental health conditions. They were very, very, very consistent. I think it was like 98% were aligned. So those were our eligibility. Well, that was our screeners, I should say.
Michelle, there's actually a couple more that I didn't notice at first. Nancy Karloff, a friend of ours, asked what was the most common reason why students were excluded, the 300 plus group.
Oh, Nancy, that's a hard question. I was not prepared to answer that, but I can send a little love note out afterwards. I think one of the considerations is that we were looking for students who are at high risk for disruption. So they either had to have been disrupted in the past, and you'll see that many students did not have prior academic disruptions because of their mental health conditions, or they had to have 3 or more of these what we would consider higher risk factors for dropout. And so they either did not meet those 2 criteria, or they didn't have a mental health condition. And we did have like a pretty wide range of students who are like, I think I have one, I don't know. But I can get some additional details. That's a good question. And I actually should know that answer.
There's one more question. Will this study open up to older adults who are going back to school who also have a mental health diagnosis?
I would love that because in our trial with our friends at Rutgers, that was a larger trial, as was FAST for the full age continuum. And older folks have different considerations than younger folks. Now, HYPE was specifically created for young people. I want to say that to be clear. So HYPE is an intervention that was specifically designed to meet the needs of young adults. But there are models like a very traditional support education model that's designed for older adults because that's the time in which it was designed when we only were thinking about older adults. But the answer to that is yes, I would love that. And if there's an opportunity to partner on that, I am here for it. So I think because Debbie turned off her camera, then that's the end of those questions. So we're going to move on a little bit to what are the folks who came into the study, what they look like. So most of our students would be considered juniors, even though most people don't use that language anymore. They had between 30 and 60 credits. What you'll see here is that their average baseline GPA was a 3.33. So once again, these students were like doing pretty well by most standards when they came into our study. A majority of our folks were identified as female. They were 20 years old on average, a little bit older, but no one was over 29. I would say, we were kind of like split here on our sexual orientation. So we had a good amount of variety, but the greatest amount of proportion of folks identified as straight. We did a pretty good job of ensuring that the race and ethnicities of folks that were in the trial looked like the folks on campus. So at this school, you'll see in the right-hand column what was the diversity of students on campus, and then the HOC column is who we saw on campus. So this is not supposed to say 45%. That's a 4.5. Just as a note, that's an error. The decimal got lost. So what we saw was like a pretty good representation of race and ethnicity. There was no significant differences from on campus than in HYPE on campus. So one of the criteria, as you know, for coming into the study was having an academic disruption. As you see, that half of our folks, maybe a little bit more than half, identified that they did not have a prior academic disruption, but we did have a lot of students, which is very common if you serve these students on campus. About 33% said that they started classes, but then could not finish them. We had about 13% of our students who dropped a majority of those classes. About 10% had taken a formal medical leave, and then some have essentially taken off a semester thereafter because of essentially exhaustion or needing to recover from that semester. So you'll see that we do have some additional reasons here, and these were our eligibility criteria: falling under GPA, on academic probation, taking off from school. The other eligibility criteria were what are the things that put people at risk for disruption. And each student reported on average about 7 different executive functioning considerations. So they had identified that they struggled in on average 7 of these items. The top 3 reported areas of difficulty was concentration and time management. Now, different from our study that we conducted earlier, and we can't disentangle if this is a COVID effect or if it's what was happening at this time, or if it's just a changing landscape of students, which is a lot of our work is trying to understand what is happening on college campuses. But about 85% of respondents stated that they had difficulty managing symptoms while in school. As a part of our diagnoses, the greatest proportion of students reported either depression or a generalized anxiety condition. So just as a note, you did not have to choose one, but select the ones that were consistent with your diagnoses. So about half of our students had parents that went to college, both parents. We had about a third of our students in the trial who were employed during their studies, but also our studies. I'm going to talk a little bit about our fidelity because, you know, a part of what we were testing is, can we teach master's level students to provide complex intervention? And this was, I think, an important component for us to learn and for others to learn too. But what we had done was created a fidelity measure, which we didn't have at the beginning of the trial because we were really, our grants timeline was ticking away and we were building lots of things as we were going. And so our fidelity score, our fidelity measure was introduced like somewhat late actually into the services. But once we developed the fidelity tool, it became a very, very helpful both quality assurance mechanism, but training tool, as I had said earlier. So if you struggled with meeting a competency, then you came in for office hours or for specialized TA. So what you'll see here is the provider mean score. And as we developed this tool, we had 5 anchor points, and 3 met your meeting criteria. So you were doing hype as designs, like at minimum. And then 4 and 5 were like, wow, you're like a superstar. So as you see here, we have each of the providers, 8 providers, and we separated them by setting. So each of our providers, as I said, they were trained, we had 2 groups that were trained differently. We smashed them up, mixed them up randomly so that we had an equal number of humans on either side with different types of training. And so those who were assigned to the psych clinic had higher rates of provider mean scores. So, and those that were assigned to disability services had some struggled to be able to maintain or to meet eligibility, criteria for fidelity. When we looked at the average scores by domain, what we saw was that there were 3 areas that on average struggled more. So you'll see here reviewing home exercises, but what you'll also see, the ones that struggled a little bit, was assigning home exercises and summarizing. So it's not those 2 things are so quick, like linked, right? So like if you never actually assign the home exercise, you can't actually review the home exercise. But what you do see is that many of these others are consistently above what we would consider like the minimum criteria for meeting fidelity. So that students were able to engage students effectively, that they were able to use time effectively, they were able to respond to major health concerns. One of the feedback that we got from our clinicians, from our MSW students, was that students really struggled with a lot of really serious things, you know, like students were managing suicidal ideations and trying to go to class, and we had people who lost people, and so they were managing quite a lot, and that also meant that our MSW students needed to respond to those things. So what we saw here, and by this, so in our earlier slide, you saw that there were differences by setting, and there may be something along that we have to give credence to, the importance of supervision or of placement. But what we see in this slide is that students were able to learn a pretty complex intervention and score pretty well. So I'm going to move on to preliminary results. I don't know, Debbie, if there's anything in the chat, or maybe let's hold those now till the end, because now we're getting very close to time. So what I'll share here are some of our preliminary results that we find to be interesting. We may not spend as much time on these as we may want to, but if anyone wants to talk more or bring it to your campus, we would be happy to talk about those. Okay, so one of our major foci for HYPE and in our group is really focusing on academic persistence. We know that there is a difference between students with mental health conditions and students without for persistence, but there may be other factors involved there, obviously, not just the mental health condition. But when we tested between the two conditions, we actually didn't find a difference. Now, there may be multiple reasons for that, but when we looked at those that completed fast, we saw that those that completed fast had a greater number of credits completed and a greater number of courses completed. And what we saw was that was both true in semester 1 and in semester 2. We did not see a difference in satisfactory academic progress, and that could be also a function of other things, like during COVID. During COVID, sorry, I had a difficulty with my mute button. During COVID, schools were not really sending people away. So there may be some components here related to the timing of where we were in COVID or following the pandemic. The second hypothesis, or that should say hypothesis 3, sorry, this is an error, was related to self-regulated learning strategies. So when we just tested the HYPE condition versus the control condition, we did not see any difference between the conditions. But when we looked at those that completed 9 sessions or more, so we wanted to really disentangle like those that completed fast, because not everyone did, which was a part of the fidelity component. But for those that did complete fast, we saw that students who completed fast at the time 1 follow-up, that they had real differences in their self-regulated learning strategies, and that it then approached significance for time 2, for both those that completed and those that completed session 9, which is the first 3 modules, the ones that did not complete cognitive flexibility. Oops, oopsie. Something's happening. Please hold. Your call is very important to us. Okay, there we go. So hypothesis 4 and 5, we were looking at educational barriers and cognitive problems. And so educational barriers is an assessment that we asked students to complete that identified what are the issues that you experience in the classroom. And so students that were, as a part of the HYPE condition, reported fewer educational barriers. So meeting timelines, taking notes, asking questions. And so we saw the same for those that completed fast. They also had fewer educational barriers. For students in the spring semester, so that's the second semester of the trial, students reported fewer cognitive problems. So I'm having a harder time. I forget appointments. I have a difficulty remembering information. I have difficulty for focusing. So those things that get in the way of like thinking in school. Once again, HYPE participants had fewer cognitive issues, reportable issues than those in the control condition, as well as those that completed fast. Now, interestingly enough, in our FAST and earlier trials of support education, we saw a pretty big effect on self-efficacy. But interestingly enough, when you're asking these other types of questions, that there were no differences between conditions here, differences in self-efficacy here. In the earlier FAST trial, we saw like a Godzilla effect of self-efficacy, like you teach these skills and students feel like really empowered. So we think actually self-efficacy is really a proxy of skill development. So in some of our exploratory factors, we looked at strategy use. So our students, if we're teaching them to do these things, are they actually doing them? And so HYPE participants said that they had a greater amount or use of strategies, and which is great. So what that means is if you teach someone something, that they will use it, which I love that idea. We saw no differences between educational supports. One of our like growing suspicions or hypotheses is about perceived stress. So the more skills you have, the more things that you utilize, the greater connected you are, that your stress then decreases. And so we didn't see a difference between groups in that, but we did see a difference for those that completed fast. And that is a very powerful finding in my mind, which is oftentimes people believe of stress as a triggering mechanism to, the beginning or the exacerbation of symptoms. Now, stress is healthy, but distress is not. So one of our kind of exploratory hypotheses that is if you prevent these kind of like stressful responses, that you may prevent kind of going down further the chain of having greater mental health symptoms. So for those that completed fast, what we saw is a significant finding in the reduction of stress. So they felt less stressed than students that did not complete fast. So similar to this idea of like, okay, can we disrupt this chain of I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm feeling stressful, I am feeling X, Y, or Z, and then that increases your likelihood or chances of otherwise feeling poorly, which then can trigger an exacerbation of symptoms, is that students in the HYPE condition reported a reduction in depression, and it approached significance for a reduction in stress. For those that completed the FAST intervention, we saw similarly a reduction in depression, and once again approached significance for feelings of distress, which for us was like a pretty big finding, given that this is one of our exploratory hypotheses. So we wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions, like larger questions. But to be able to summarize what we found in this trial was, while we didn't have enough power, that we wanted to recruit 180 students to be able to have 90 in each condition. And so we were unable to recruit that in the timeline of our MSW student interns. And so there are some learnings there about how many cohorts do you need to train to be able to do a trial on campus, but also what does that sustainability model look like on campus? But given where we were and what we had, that these were very promising results. So this is the first testing of HYPE on campus, as well as it's like the first testing of really using a real world model, right? So being able to do this in a setting with very little control on our side, but being able to use implementation science strategies to train people, to support supervision. So this was like a first of many. And we were testing a lot of things at the same time. COVID made us wildly flexible in our research designs. But so while we were empowered to show significance for some of these bigger outcomes like persistence, we did have like pretty important signs that like, hey, this is a promising practice. So we also saw that we can teach MSW interns and they could be very well trained. I think one of the things that we want to explain, be able to further explore are practitioner characteristics. There were some folks that didn't really want to do all the components to HYPE, and so they didn't. So when we're thinking about these implementation science outcomes of acceptability, some students didn't find all pieces of HYPE acceptable, so they didn't do them. But we do recognize that there are probably some things here that we could bolster related to supervision and setting that may impact the type of outcomes that we saw. And I think the aha moment for us here at UMass for this trial was that fast seems to be a secret sauce. So for a very, very, very long time, we have focused almost myopically on symptoms. And that's how I was trained. I was trained in psych rehab, but it was really the intersection of higher ed and psych, right? The mental health symptoms and education. Um, but what FAST is starting to teach us is that maybe there is something else here, which is maybe school isn't overly stressful in and of itself, and maybe it doesn't trigger mental health symptoms, and maybe it's not the mental health condition so much what we focus on, but maybe it's the skills that are underneath that. So how, when someone gives me a syllabi, what do I do with it? Do I keep it on my computer on a piece of paper, or do I transfer it somewhere? So this idea of like, how do you organize yourself as a student? Because when you were in high school, lots of people helped you with that. But when you're a student away, and that's in this setting, that was the case, it was primarily residential, was you then need to organize these things yourself. And so FAST seems to be this component of work that teaches the skills that are critical for success and managing the competing demands of being a student. And arguably then being able to manage the competing demands of a complex job after you get your degree. So we're very excited to start thinking more about what does FAST look like in higher ed and in other interventions as well, as a way of being for students and other people to be able to manage all the things that are coming in so they do not have to keep everything in their head. So this idea of organizing oneself really seems like a very critical component to services that historically we've been missing in mental health services, as well as in support education, supported employment, or supporting people with mental health conditions in other settings. So with that, I am going to transition us to some questions and comments and thoughts. I see the chat may be exploding a little bit. So thank you for your thoughts and considerations and for being with us here today. This is our email addresses. I'm going to take down the share for a bit so that Debbie, if there are any questions, we can see each other. And so thank you guys for your attention today.
Mhm. For sure. And Michelle, you're getting some applause in the question and answer box. And a thank you from someone who said it's always good to know that there's hope towards recovery. Yeah. There have been a couple of questions, some about research, some about training, and kind of where things go next. So, why don't I start with a research question from Veronica about seasonal affective disorder, and was that taken into account during the, in the research?
Well, that's a good question. We didn't ask people about SAD, but every period or data collection period, there was a symptom measure. And so we use the CCAPS in this study, which is it's the measure that most schools use in psychological services and counseling services to identify symptoms. So we did ask people about those experiences, but not necessarily related to seasonal affective disorder. But we can look at that. So if there's a difference during those times where it's dark, I mean, we're all feeling it, right? So so we can look at that. So that's a great question. Thank you.
We had a question about how much training does a service provider need to deliver with fidelity? And I think that's a really interesting question. I was the training director in this project, so I can kind of start us off if that helps, Michelle. But we were training new providers who were very new to the field and who had not had, as Michelle spoke about earlier, a lot of practice with working with people, talking with people, responding to people, never mind kind of doing a very intentional and comprehensive service like HYPE. So we built in about 200 plus hours of training that we did with two different groups of MSW students. And that training involved a couple of things. It was conducted on Moodle in part, which meant that we kind of flipped the classroom and gave people conceptual information online that they could read about, watch a presentation on, review materials and curriculum, and really sort of study up on the conceptual stuff. And then we followed that up with live training. And the live training involved sometimes presentation, but mostly discussion and practice and demonstration of how you used your skills to support a student in all of the different ways. We followed that up with fidelity checks eventually, and written and verbal feedback and support. We provided a lot of technical assistance. This was not a spray and pray kind of training where you throw it out there and hope it sticks. It really was a competency development training. And so we looked to see that people were learning the skills that they needed to learn in order to provide quality services. So that TA was important. I think Michelle mentioned before that we went to team meetings and supported the entire team and the supervisors in their provision of HYPE. So it was pretty intentional and comprehensive. But part of your question is about, what do they need to deliver HYPE with fidelity? And I think, part of that is the audit and feedback piece that Michelle mentioned earlier, to not only know that people have heard the information or seen it somewhere, but really are adopting it in their practice. So reviewing their sessions and taking a look at what they're actually doing with folks in the moment became very, very important. And we aligned our fidelity scale with the principles and values of HYPE and the activities of HYPE, so that we were looking at those things like, did you provide an intentional service through setting an agenda and taking a look at the goal plan and doing the activities that you had planned to do, so that it did not become just a listening session, a chat session, but really intentional, powerful services that helped students to build skills, connect with resources, and utilize the accommodations and assistive technology that they needed to utilize to be successful. So, Michelle, I don't know if you want to add to that, but
No, I think that's very helpful. I think one of the things that we were working towards here is not only in developing practitioners to be intentional. One of the things that we found in our work is that many providers show up unprepared to actually help someone. And that actually doesn't help a student stay in school. So HYPE is not actually therapy. If you need therapy, we will help you connect to therapy. We will help to speak with your therapist about like, hey, maybe, we're seeing this, maybe you're seeing that too. The intention of HYPE is to reduce disruption. And so in our training, we wanted to be very specific on what are the things that are red flags. How do you identify them early? How do you partner with a student? These were also students. So there was a peer relationship as well, which in our qualitative work with our student participants, they were like, it was really helpful to talk to another student about how difficult it is being a student. And we're like, yeah, of course, that makes good sense. But the students, our MSW students, were largely untrained. And so one of the questions in the chat was, what was the previous experience of students and how did you identify MSW students? And we had an open call for applications, and students applied. There was a stipend associated with it. So there was an incentive to participate. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was, a little something when we could do that. And so it was a competitive process to identify students. Um, there wasn't an overwhelming number of applicants. I want to be clear about that. It's not like we had the cream of the crop and, we were very late to the game. Students were already identified. I shouldn't say we didn't have the cream of the crop. We had amazing students, but some people are like, oh, you took the most high performing students or the most experience. And our students didn't have a lot of experience, MSW students. And to be an intentional service, and it's a complex intervention. You're providing generalized support. It's goal development. It's what are the services and supports that you need to be able to meet those goals. And many people think that that is a requirement of people who have postmasters and real life experience serving folks. So I would say that, to Debbie's point, the training was a part of their professional development. And that they got an intensive amount of in-class training with practice before then they started working with people. But one of the benefits of the design of this is that the open trial, the first part, people were seen as like practice participants. So they were getting their kinks out with folks who knew that they were working with someone who's never done this before. And as we had structured it, that it was bi-directional learning so that those students could give us feedback as intervention developers and the MSW students so that those skills could be refined for the open trial. And that is actually one of the reasons why we couldn't extend the study longer, was that we would have to go through that process again, and we didn't embed that in the process. So we had 2 years to train a cohort of students and then to implement the study. And so that's how that's why the training, I think, was so in depth, but required because it's once again, a complex intervention.
Yeah. Michelle, one of the questions that we got early on was where we're taking this research next. And I think that's a really good question. Other questions have been around, where does this exist? And we're very clear, this is our very first trial of Hype on Campus. So, we are building this, but where do you hope to build this beyond this
Well, I would love for schools to be like, yes, we want Hype on campus. So we would love to take Hype out of research and into practice. So I want to be clear about that. Research is great for research purposes, but it only is great when it can be then applied to real world settings. So we are always looking for partners and those that are interested in adopting new practices. Our next trial in line with this is actually to embed FAST in an academic resource center. So where one goes for tutoring or writing lab, so that academic center on campus. So we have a funded trial coming up where we will be embedding FAST in that type of service center. And we think, some of the things that we saw in setting here, like disability services or psych services, we thought that wouldn't it be cool to kind of test it in an environment that is designed for academic persistence? That is exactly the reason why the Center for Tutoring and writing labs, they exist to help students thrive academically, to be able to pass their classes, develop those skills. So that's the next phase of our research here that's related to this trial, is taking FAST, kind of separating it out of Hype and embedding it in the academic resource center so that we can develop skills of other humans that are supporting students to develop executive function, to be able to teach executive functioning skills. And then we'll look there to see, what the results look like. Or do students do they come there at higher rates? Do they get, what does fidelity look like in that type of setting? So that's our next phase for this.
Yeah. There was a question about, do we know if any of the MSW students continue to use the training they received after graduation? And I just put in a comment that, this became kind of ingrained for people. They were trained, hard and really had a lot of support around using the competencies and the material. And so we had a comment in a recent meeting from one of our previous providers, one of our Hype on Campus providers said, I can't not ask about people's calendars and time management. It's just become part of who I am. And he sort of said, thanks, Michelle. But it's absolutely become part of who he is as a provider, which is great. I love that.
Yeah, so what I would say is I think that we heard very positive things from a lot of the MSW students. We also heard some MSW students say like, yeah, I never need to do this again. So that that's a real thing, like some people just like a job. You're like, yes, I loved this thing and I'll do it again for the rest of my life. And others that are like, I never need to do this thing again. So there were differences in opinion of hype. And I mean, it's very defined. What I would say, one of the things I will make note of is in addition to comments like that, Debbie had said, like it becomes a part of your kind of like fabric, like we ingrained people that, calendars are important, to-do lists are important. So in addition to people being able to take that to their practices thereafter, which is great, I'm very thrilled about that. But we also had really outstanding practitioners and in that program, and then went on to hire one of them. And we would have hired more if we had additional resources for sure. And so one of those interventionists now work for us in providing those interventions. So some of them drank the Kool-Aid like we did and believe that this is a thing. And but we had very, very talented MSW students that were really able to engage really effectively with young people who were really their peers, and effectively help them get connected and to teach real skills. And so it would be hard for me to think that that could be divorced from a human after leaving the trial. But they were very successful when they came in, had a lot of talent, and I hope that we contributed to their ability to move that forward and through their practice. But we do know that there were humans that would have been hired into our group as interventionists moving forward should we had had more resources for a future study. So that was, I think, a very good indicator. One of the other things that I will say is if you teach fast, you too become better at those skills. So it is not just a benefit to the people that you're serving. You're like, oh, I can do this a little bit differently, or, oh, this is a great tool for me too. So by nature of teaching it, you're also learning it because most people are not wildly skilled or have complex development of those types of skills. So I think that it's, bi-directionally beneficial for those that provide it. They also learn it.
Exactly right. If we have time for one more question, somebody had asked, okay. Someone had asked, sorry, glitch, how to implement in all areas, if not already available nationwide. So how this might be implemented, in all areas of the country.
Well, I don't know who asked that question, but I'm here for it. I'm here for it. So, the good thing about having a manualized intervention is that it exists like in paper, right? And so we also have the capacity to partner with places that are like, hey, we want to do this thing. And so we have been thinking and planning to do a fast trial institute where training institute rather, where we are teaching providers how to do this in higher ed. So we too want to be able to translate from research to practice. And so if that's hype on campus, a larger model, if it is fast, just the executive functioning training, if it's identifying where on campus can we build and coordinating supports, our group exists to translate what we're doing from research into practice. We're not really researchers. I mean, we are researchers, but not in the thing that we only study items. We are developing interventions to change practice because we know that young people with mental health conditions get into these settings and they can graduate from these settings, which then allows them opportunities to have really great careers that avoid a poverty pathway, which is the reason why we're here. We see older adults who really struggle to maintain employment and have unfinished educations. And we think that that's the service delivery issue. It's not a person issue. We have to figure out how to change service delivery so that people can get into the schools that they want. And it's not just college, it could be training, it could be an apprenticeship, but it's how do you manage those things as you're growing and as your mental health condition is evolving as a young person. And we believe that that's a service system issue. So we're here to change the service system. So if there is an opportunity, we are interested in chatting about it. And I just have to make a note that Georgetta Davis just put in takeaways from the meeting. She gave us our tasks. I'm looking at the list here. So, but I appreciate that. And so, yes, if there are opportunities, we're here for it. And we will put you folks on the list. Should there be other training opportunities available for FAST or hype on campus. And there's more research to come out of this. This is just the tip of the iceberg of the analyses that we have to conduct. So also happy to keep people posted.
Thank you. Okay, Dee, I think we can bring you back in, and we've gotten lots of applause and thanks and great presentations. Thank you, Michelle, for kind of bringing us the results of this study that we've been working on for a long time. Really appreciate it.
Well, Debbie, without your assistance, we wouldn't actually have a study. So just to give props where props are due, research is nice, but the intervention is what we're researching. So we often say like, it's about the research, but it's really about the intervention. So thank you, Debbie, for your contribution. And without you and your team, we would have been lost.
Yes, I want to thank Dr. Mullen and Debbie for being here and for this presentation on Hype on Campus. Thank you everyone who attended. There will be a survey that'll pop up after you leave, and it would be great to get feedback about what you thought of the presentation that we'll share with Dr. Mullen and Debbie.
Stop saying that, Dee.
Michelle, okay, sorry. You worked so hard to get it though. But I want to thank everyone. The recording will be posted on the Transitions to Adulthood Center for Research's website, and we will send out the link when it's ready to all the people who registered, as well as our regular listserv. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, folks.